We all compare ourselves to other people. We do this even when the comparisons aren't meaningful, even when they make us unhappy, even when they don't actually make us better, smarter, or more productive human beings. And we seem to be doing it more and more. So why do we compare ourselves to other people? Is there any benefit? Well, let's go and see what stacks up. And if there isn't, how can we stop it? Stay tuned to find out more. What's going on, guys? Richard Rozza with the Personal Development Channel. In this episode, I will be covering some of the psychology of why we compare ourselves to others. And then in part 2, a few tips to help with this. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. And if at any point you like what you see, give it a little like. Let's get to it. We're designed to understand ourselves. This capacity for self-reflection is one of the defining characteristics of our species. In other words, we have a fundamental need to evaluate ourselves. And the only way to do that is in reference to something else. And since we live in a world populated by other life forms that look and behave a lot like us, they're us humans, then that's who we then decide to compare ourselves with. Which is why you'll compare yourself to a model on the cover of Vogue or that ripped guy you know, rather than your internal standard of beauty or a textbook on human physiology. This peculiar drive was first explored seriously by a social psychologist named Leon Festinger in 1954. Festinger basically said that people evaluate their opinions and abilities by comparing themselves to other people for two reasons. First, to reduce uncertainty in areas which they're comparing themselves, and second, to learn how to define themselves. He called this concept social comparison, and it's one of the biggest contributions to the field of social psychology today. What Festinger really nailed was that human beings can't actually define themselves intrinsically or independently. They can only define themselves in relation to someone else. When it comes to the big question of identity and self and who the fucking hell am I need to look at other people. But he actually went a bit further than that, and that's where things get really interesting. For one thing, Festinger pointed out that the tendency to compare ourselves to another person decreases as the difference between our opinion or ability and the other person's increases. In other words, the more similar we are to another person in some way we think is important, the more we tend to compare ourselves to that person. That means we're more likely to compare ourselves to a colleague at our level than we would to the CEO. Just like we're more likely to compare ourselves to a runner in our weekly running group than we are to Usain Bolt. The difference between you and Usain Bolt is probably astronomical, but the difference between you and another amateur runner is probably quite small, which makes them a more attainable and therefore compelling comparison. Festinger also pointed out that when we stop comparing ourselves to other people, we often experience hostility and derogation toward those people, as long as continuing to compare ourselves to them brings unpleasant consequences. In other words, if we stop comparing ourselves to that super fit runner in our running group because it's making us feel bad, then we'll tend to deal with those feelings by mentally tearing them down. If we can't deal with the negative feelings of the comparison, then we'll swap them for more helpful ones: anger, hostility, and a tendency to simply just write people off. If you've ever felt a twinge of envy about someone close to you and then found yourself subtly turning against them in your mind, then this process will sound familiar. It's a strange script that all of us have running in the background to keep us feeling secure in our positions and self-concepts. Finally, and this is probably the most important thing for us, Festinger pointed out that the more important we think some particular group of people is, the more pressure we'll feel to conform to that group in our abilities and opinions. In other words, we'll feel more pressure to kick ass in our boxing class than we will be to perform in a street fight with a bunch of randoms. The difference is that we think our boxing class is more important, comparison to whereas the ability of some of the random backstreet fighters on the street probably matters very little. Which, if you think about it, helps explain why we pay so much for those classes. We pay because we think the group is important, but we also think the group is important because we pay, and because everyone else is paying too. Now, all of this might sound pretty obvious. We know we have a need to compare ourselves. We know we need to tend to compare ourselves to people who are similar to us. We know that we compare our abilities and our opinions to groups we deem important. And we know that the comparison often dredges up some unpleasant feelings. So what? Isn't that just the way we're designed? And don't we need to compare ourselves to other people in order to know how we're doing? Otherwise, why would we become better? Is comparing ourselves to other people really so bad? Great questions. To answer them, we need to understand why we're comparing ourselves in the first place. Self-evaluation versus self-enhancement. For the past couple of years, I've listened to quite a few podcasts. All the while, I'd be taking mental notes, picking up tricks and tips, trying to see where I fit in the podcast hierarchy, figuring out how I stacked up against my idols and my peers. I did all this in the name of research as a way of gathering new skills and measuring my progress along the way. Sometimes listening to these shows would leave me excited, thinking, I can do this. Other times listening to them would leave me confused and dejected, thinking, I'm not sure I have the right knowledge or delivery to do this as well as them. It took me quite some time to realise that comparing myself to other people was actually doing two things. Trying to figure out how good I actually was and trying to make myself feel better. Recognising the difference between these two different motivations for comparison is the key to separating your healthy comparison from your unhealthy comparison. Behind these questions, though, you'll notice a few different motivations. One motivation is to understand the objective quality of your work. As it happens, this kind of comparison often gives us a very distorted view of ourselves. In fact, research has shown that we tend to prioritize feedback that makes us look good and desirable and ignore feedback that makes us look weak, undesirable, or generally less than. So even if we succeed in making ourselves feel better, our brains are often playing a clever trick with the data we're using to arrive at that conclusion. As long as self-enhancement is your goal, then comparing yourself to other people will always make you miserable. Either your comparison will artificially boost your ego, temporarily, making you feel superior to the people you're comparing yourself to, or your comparison will unearth the vulnerabilities you might not want to face, leaving you exposed to familiar feelings of anger, envy, shame, whatever it is. Which brings us back to our original question. Is it really so bad to compare ourselves to other people? Well, the answer is it depends. If we're comparing ourselves for self-assessment, then wondering how we stack up is natural, healthy, and often very helpful. I'd even argue it's necessary. But if we're comparing ourselves for self-enhancement, then this process can quickly become obsessive, toxic, and often very confusing. The problem is that when we compare ourselves, we're often doing both simultaneously without even realizing it. And often, at times, we think we're trying to assess ourselves when we're actually trying to enhance ourselves, which is how we can justify this destructive habit under the guise of doing our research. Just as I used to do when listening to all those podcasts. That's a trap some of the highest performers in the world can fall into. And it's one of the biggest paradoxes of self-improvement. We need to study other people in order to measure our progress. But by measuring our progress, we often end up inflating ourselves, tearing ourselves down, or toggling between one or the other, often at the expense of the people we're comparing ourselves to. And those people, in turn, are almost certainly doing the exact same thing with us. And because no one talks about it, we don't realise that we're all comparing ourselves to one another in a bizarre unstable, often toxic hall of mirrors. No wonder all this comparison shit makes us miserable. But there's another reason that comparing ourselves to other people makes us so unhappy, and it has to do with the ideas we already have about ourselves. When we compare ourselves to other people, we tend to think of it like fishing. We cast our nets around the people we choose to compare ourselves to, check out the catch of observations that come back, and then use those observations to form an opinion about ourselves, whether we're as good, as smart, as talented, as good looking, and so on. In reality, the process is much more complicated, because when we compare ourselves to other people, we almost always have some pre-existing idea about how we stack up. Remember, we've been engaging in social comparison since the time we were kids. That means we've had years, decades to form all these kinds of opinions about ourselves. About everything from our professional talents to our social skills, our athletic abilities to our moral standings. Those opinions are what make up our self-concept and self-esteem. They're like the scaffolding of ourselves, the pylons propping up our identities. Psychologists call these core beliefs self-views, and we carry them around with us wherever we go. Our self-views are insanely important. They help us make sense of the world around us and allow us to navigate that world in a way that is safe, coherent, and stable. For example, if you have a self-view that says, I am capable professional, then that belief is likely to help you to walk into your office with confidence, handle a difficult situation, and then take on a tough new project. Alternatively, if you have a self-view that says, I don't know enough to be in my position, then that belief will probably make the office a stressful place, encourage you to take a backseat in meetings, and shrink away behind the scenes. But here's what's interesting. No matter what self-view you happen to hold, that opinion is allowing you to make sense of your world. With one belief, your world is a positive, promising, growth-oriented place. With the other, it's a self-conscious, taxing, demanding one. Either way, the views you hold about yourself will keep that world consistent. And to your mind, it doesn't matter if those views are totally accurate. It only matters that they work. And they work by propping up that self-concept and keeping your world stable and consistent. So it's no surprise that these self-views are very precious to us. We need them. And because we need them, our minds become very anxious when those beliefs get threatened. We need to constantly keep feeding them, reinforcing them, building them up. Because who would we be if we didn't think these thoughts about ourselves? What would the world be like without them? It's like driving across a rickety bridge every day. Knowing that the bridge is in a state of disrepair, the thought of tearing it down and building a new one might be the smartest thing to do, but hey, it's getting me across, and it's been getting me across for years. So, maybe let's just leave the bridge alone. I like this bridge. I know this bridge. Don't mess with my bridge. So, we end up protecting these views about ourselves very carefully. To do that, we seek our feedback that confirms that the office is friendly and exciting and stressful and hostile, depending on which self-view we happen to hold. Which means that when we compare ourselves to other people, we're often comparing ourselves with a certain opinion already in mind. We're not acting like a blank slate waiting for comparison feedback to tell us who we are. We already know who we are, or rather think we know who we are, and then compare ourselves to others in a way that helps confirm that pre-existing belief. That allows us to maintain the ideas we have about ourselves so we don't rock the mental boat too much. It also helps make us stable and predictable to one another, so that when we come across a new person or interact with an old one, we can predict how they'll behave and decide how to behave towards them in return. William Swan developed this theory called self-verification, which was another major contribution to social psychology. If you're still with me, you're probably wondering, what the fuck are you talking about, Richard, and what does this all mean? Well, I'd like you to go over and watch part 2, where I'm going to wrap this up into a simpler form. But today I really wanted to get a little bit deeper with some of the psychology with this subject, because it is so vast. A lot of the subjects I talk about are vast, but I don't always go into this much depth and talk about the psychology behind some of it. But today I have, and I'd be really keen to see what your comments are on this. But like I said, if you would like to know more about this, and I'm going to debunk this and break this down in a real simple form, if you got a little bit confused somewhere along the way, then you need to watch number 2, and I'll also be giving you some real tools to support with this. That's it for part 1. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and if you enjoyed the content, give it a like. And if you would like to be notified of when new episodes are released, then click the notification bell. If you think this could help someone you know, then please go ahead and share. And finally, come and join our community on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. All of the links will be in the description below. This has been Richard Rozza. Stay safe and keep active.